When war broke out in 1861, neither the United States or Confederate governments were prepared for long-term confinement of enemy soldiers. Initially, troops captured in the first 2 years of war were subject to battlefield paroles that returned them to their lines in a matter of weeks, if not days. In 1862, an agreement formalized exchange policies. The Dix Hill Cartel created a system that exchanged soldiers in equal numbers who were of equal ranks. These exchange and parole policies were problematic from the very beginning. Accusations and confusion about the number of equivalent prisoners happened almost immediately. Commanders were well aware that battlefield paroles also benefited the army that needed troops the most. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation opened the doorway completely for black soldiers to enter the United States Army. It would be their presence in the ranks that altered the system of exchanges that summer. Confederate officials refused to exchange black prisoners on the grounds that a majority of them were escaped slaves, and thus property, who were ineligible for military service and could not be exchanged for a white soldier. The Union commanders stood their ground and would only exchange black soldiers and their white commanders as equal. Both the Union and Confederacy were now required to hold hundreds and later thousands of soldiers in captivity. Over 400,000 soldiers were held prisoners of war during the Civil War. Today we stand here at Andersonville, also known as Camp Sumter Military Prison. During the Civil War, it was one of the most famous prisons, as it continues to be today. However, it was by no means the only prison. Each government approached prison establishment in different ways, but both created prisons based on 3 key factors: defensibility, available resources, and transportation. In the North, prisons were shaped out of existing military fortifications like Fort Monroe or Fort Delaware. Some prisons were also built out of existing racetracks and fairgrounds, military training grounds, and other structures. One of the most surprising prisons during the Civil War is on a small place called Bellows Island in York Harbor. An 11-point star fortification built during the War of 1812, it later became Fort Wood, a recruiting depot and prisoner of war camp for Confederate soldiers. A few decades later, the fort was filled in and became the base of the Statue of Liberty. In the South, many prisons were created in warehouses or open fields. Andersonville and Salisbury are both examples of open-air stockades. The South also worked to centralize prison populations in a small number of large prisons. For example, over 33,000 United States soldiers were held here at Andersonville in August of 1864. Other Southern prisons took the shape of warehouses or even islands, in the case of Belle Isle in the heart of Richmond, Virginia. After battle, prisoners were taken to the rear, under guard, moved to a train depot, and transported to the nearest prison camp, sometimes spending days on a train. Upon arrival, they would then be counted and placed inside the prison camp, meeting their new fate as prisoners of war. After accounting, guards were able to seize things that they wanted from prisoners. These items could be clothing, food, or money. Any item that a prisoner managed to smuggle inside a prison could aid their survival. Prisoners on both sides of the conflict faced similar hazards, such as contaminated drinking water, overcrowding, and diseases that passed between prisoners and prison camps. Diarrhea, dysentery, gangrene, scurvy, and smallpox were all conditions that plagued prisoners. The overcrowding in many of the stockade prisons led to a humanitarian disaster, as supplies were not always diverted to the prisoners, but rather pushed to the front lines. In both the North and the South, civilians attempted to aid prisoners as far as they were allowed. Some of the civilians even risked charges of treason to bring food and clothing to enemy prisoners. The Civil War prison system was successful in one major way. Escape was made virtually impossible for a majority of prisoners. There are some daring escape attempts by enlisted men and officers, but the remote locations, well-guarded perimeter, and hostile population ensured that for most prisoners, they would be recaptured, punished, and returned to captivity. However, slave populations were known to aid escaping Union soldiers to try to get to their lines, whether through food, directions, or shelter. By the end of the Civil War, almost 56,000 soldiers died in captivity, both governments failing to protect the lives of their men. Today, over 24 historic prison sites are managed by federal, state, and private organizations. Each site serves as a reminder of the cost of war and the fact that men fought for their lives, not only on the battlefield, but within the walls of a prison.
Most photographs in the years after photography was invented in 1839 would have been daguerreotypes, after its inventor, Louis Daguerre. They were also making tintypes, but both of these processes made single positives. You could not easily make a copy of these photos. You had to take another photo of that photo to make a copy. But the invention of the wet plate process was the first real widespread process that actually created a photographic negative, a piece of glass on which the image was affixed through some light-sensitive chemicals and a sticky substance called collodion. If you took that negative and put a black background behind it, that negative became a positive, and that is essentially an ambrotype. If, however, you took that negative and put it against some light-sensitive, maybe albumin paper, suddenly you could print that photograph in the sun. You could do it again and again and again, and you could make 1,000 prints from one photo. You could also take that photographic print or that photographic negative, lend it to an artist who could make an engraving or a woodcut out of it, and those things, those processes could be printed in newspapers of the time. Harper's Weekly had 1 million subscribers at that time, so one photo could be seen by 1 million people as an engraving or a woodcut. These photographers also sold photos, and most of these photos are also being sold using the wet plate process by printing cartes de visite. People had calling cards of their own image they could hand out to people, and also through stereo views. Most photographers' outdoor views were recorded using a twin lens camera an eye width apart, and by doing that and putting these things on a special card into a viewer, they could see these pictures in 3D. And in that fashion, there was a huge craze in the 1850s and 60s by which people could travel the world by looking at photos in their 3D viewer. These very processes actually led to the birth of photojournalism, in my opinion, which started in 1862 on the Virginia Peninsula. After securing photos of not-so-fresh graves at Manassas, on the Virginia Peninsula, suddenly Union photographers, Northern photographers, are securing fresh graves, and then a field hospital, and then going northward, dead horses on the Cedar Mountain battlefield, before coming here where we stand at Antietam, where they secured 20 photos of dead soldiers on the battlefield. And these photos, when they were debuted in New York and elsewhere, shocked the nation. This was not a glorious war. This showed grotesque, bloated soldiers far from home, face pressed to the earth. It was not what they had pictured a battlefield to be, and suddenly it really changed people's perception of war. Only on a few more occasions, notably at Corinth, Mississippi, at Fredericksburg twice, at Gettysburg, at Spotsylvania, and Petersburg, were Union photographers able to secure photos of the dead where they fell. So it's a very finite resource, 97 photos taken of dead soldiers on battlefields in total, and that's why we study them very carefully. There are other important things to know about Civil War photography, such as that most Civil War photos were taken by Union photographers in the East. The South quickly ran out of photochemicals, the blockade really worked, and these chemicals were slow to reach to the West, and the vast distances between battlefields in the West compared to the East made it so that most photos were recorded by Union photographers in the East. These photographers managed to secure at Charleston a photo of actual combat, and you see troop movements actually at Second Battle of Fredericksburg. But there are also a lot of myths associated with Civil War photography. People are suggesting that photographers are moving bodies all around to get the perfect view, which they are known to have done only once. People suggest that Civil War negatives all have washed away in people's greenhouses, which is just not the case, and there are scores of other myths associated with Civil War photography, but the negatives are there. That we know where the negatives are, and by the way, they're almost entirely at the National Archives, the Smithsonian Institution, the Library of Congress, which are high-res online, as well as at the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. We can see just about all of the 10,000 documentary photos taken during the Civil War. We know which ones they took. We have catalogs. But the negatives themselves were much larger than the 35mm negatives that most of us grew up with. Rather, they were 4 by 10 inches or even larger than that, 20 or 30 times larger than negatives on a 35mm camera. Therefore, you can blow up and see great details within photos. You can catch people smiling in Civil War photos. You can actually read names on gravestones, things that the photographers could have had no hope of doing. So, go to the Library of Congress site, check out the National Archives website, browse through these photos together, and learn something on your own about the Civil War. Earthworks and fortifications predate the Civil War, but the increased firepower and accuracy and range of shoulder-carried firearms as well as rifled artillery would all but necessitate the use of more earthworks, fortifications, and semi-permanent fortifications in the Civil War. as the war started, a whole bunch of officers might have thought hiding behind breastworks or being behind breastworks or earthworks was somehow undignified, or that those troops would not be inclined to go out from those breastworks and actually launch attacks and fight. But as the Civil War went on, it became clear to soldiers on both sides, officers and privates alike, that somehow, if you could get something between you and the enemy, it not only saved life, but it could also turn your defensive force into one that could repel an enemy attack of 3, 4, 5 times its number. Even a small fortification that a soldier might be able to dig, a simple earthwork, an 18 inches high, 2 feet thick, that in itself could help slow or stop bullets and really keep your command safer. And that's something troops did increasingly as the Civil War went on. Now that's the simplest format. These trenches were, as the war went on, much deeper, much more substantial, until these were substantial earthworks. Sometimes they had revetments, something that would keep steady walls in there, and they could also bank out spots for artillery to fire through. They could also have head logs on top of that, which would protect your head while you look through a small area and fire at your enemy. And it's not just earth. You're going to use the natural terrain around you. You're usually not going to construct a defensive line on some sort of a low reverse slope at the bottom of a valley. No, you're going to try to be on the military crest like we are here on Little Round Top. But you could also use rails from fences. You could use anything you could get your hands on. There are photos that show Confederate fortifications in Atlanta and Cold Harbor, and they're using picket fences in their fortifications. Anything that could stop bullets or repel some sort of enemy fire. In some cases, especially when you might be there for a little while, you might make some sort of a semi-permanent fortification. This could be a lunette, something behind which you put one cannon. A lunette is sort of a demi-lune or half-moon shaped fortification. You could put one cannon, you could put an entire regiment behind a particularly large lunette, such as the 2nd Texas Lunette at Vicksburg. You could also have a redan. A redan is like a lunette, but it doesn't have to be moon-shaped. It could be triangular or otherwise, but it has an open back like the 3rd Louisiana redan at Vicksburg as well. Or you could have a full-on redoubt, and that is more of what we call a fort today. It is fully enclosed, and that fort would normally have bomb proofs. It could have covered ways so you could move throughout the fort in safety. It would have some sort of a step where you could step up and shoot under the headlogs, any sort of advantage that you could slow down your enemy with. Now, you don't just build a fort or an earthwork, okay? You need to prevent against things that might happen to you while you're there. If you are behind an earthwork and they get around that earthwork, you are suddenly in trouble. That is, unless you construct traverses next to that earthwork, which might allow part of your unit to turn to one side and fire in another direction. And there are a number of other things you're going to want to do. Number one, you're going to want a clear field of fire in front of your fortification to the degree possible. Field of fire is one of the most important things of the Civil War, especially with defensive tactics. So you're going to want a clear field of fire. Ideally, you will have a fortified picket line in front of your fortification, and somewhere out in front, you also might want obstructions to your enemy. Abattis or entanglements or chevaux de frise, pointed logs that are going to point out towards your enemy, anything to slow them down while they're trying to get you. The fortress itself had to also be conducive to the time in which it was. You have an incredibly powerful facility, a brick fort called Fort Pulaski, which was seemed to be impregnable. Robert E. Lee helped design the thing. It has walls more than 11 feet thick in some places, and yet, once it was subject to Union long-range, powerful rifle artillery fire, it was decimated. And suddenly the days of the brick fort were over. Right across from Fort Pulaski, a little ways down, is Fort McAllister, which is an earthen fort, which could absorb those long-range shells that really couldn't do damage to the fort. And if it did, you could just pile some more dirt up, and there you go. Within your fort itself, you are also going to have things very basic like sandbags and gabion baskets. These are sort of baskets that you could fill with earth and would help strengthen your particular fortress. These fortifications were not meant to be permanent, but in many cases, soldiers simply spent a couple of days working on an earthwork, and we can go back more than 150 years later and still see very impressive earthworks. So go to Petersburg, go to Vicksburg, see these impressive fortifications, and learn just a little bit more about the Civil War.
The United States Army in the American Civil War used 2 flags per regiment. The Stars and Stripes was called the national colors. The national colors first came into use by the United States Army during the Mexican War. Prior to that time, the national colors was a blue flag with the national coat of arms, which is the eagle with the arrows and the olive branches, and below that would be the ribbon with the unit designation on it. Then the regimental color was the other flag used by Union regiments. At the time of the Civil War, those were blue with the national coat of arms on it. When a regiment was advancing in line of battle towards the enemy, the color guard would advance 6 paces in front of the regiment. That is so everyone to both sides of the color guard could see where they were going. They would guide on the colors, and you would read that in the books. Guide on the colors, guide on the flag, and the colonel behind them is yelling the orders to the color guard, and the color guard is basically moving as the colonel has them going. It's kind of like a steering wheel. That's how the colonel drives his regiment. Besides unit colors for the infantry, cavalry, and artillery, the Union Army also used very large flags. The largest flags that they would make would be called garrison flags. These were incredibly big flags, usually about 16 by 24 feet, and they were designed to fly over fortification. They also were issued storm flags because when it started to rain, these big flags would soak up quite a bit of water. So they would lower the big flag and raise the smaller flag, which is usually about 10 by 16 feet. And then you would have post flags and flags for buildings and army offices and things like that. These flags were not made of silk. They were typically made of wool bunting, a more durable material. The Confederate Army used only 1 flag per regiment. That was because they were using the Hardee's Tactics Drill Manual, which called for only 1 flag per regiment at the time. What a lot of people don't know is that the Confederate Army used more than 1 battle flag. The diagonally crossed Saltire or St. Andrew's Cross, dubbed the Southern Cross. That's the most famous of the battle flags, and that flag came into being in November of 1861 when they were issued to what would become the Army of Northern Virginia at Centerville, Virginia. These flags were square and would remain square in that army for the rest of the war. However, the Confederate Army would use upwards of 19 patterns and sub-patterns of battle flags during the Civil War, the Western armies in particular using banners that didn't even resemble the Southern Cross battle flag. In addition to the different battle flags, the Confederacy created 3 national flags. The first national in March of 1861, which sort of resembled the United States flag, a blue canton, red bar, red bar, and a certain amount of stars representing the number of states that had seceded. That was replaced in May 1863 by the second national flag, a white flag with a canton that had the Southern Cross in it. And then in January to March of 1865 would come the Confederate third national flag, which was the same as the second national basically, except they added a vertical red bar on the fly end. Now all 3 of those flags would actually get used as battle flags as well. In fact, the reason why they would replace the first national flag with different battle flags was because it resembled the Union flag on a smoke-filled battlefield and in the distance. However, it was the only Confederate flag that would actually see combat use from the beginning to the very end of the Civil War. The Union Army had a number of ethnic regiments. The most predominant were the Germans, the second were the Irish. A lot of the Irish flags, of course, would be green and have the Harp of Erin and a slogan in Gaelic, Erin go bragh, painted on the flag. The Irish Brigade of the Army of the Potomac was one of the most famous groups of Irish troops, and their colors were gorgeous and shot to pieces in a number of different battles. The Irish were pretty predominant in a lot of the port areas of the Confederacy. They too would use the Harp of Erin on some of their flags. For example, the 8th Alabama Infantry had a Harp of Erin on one side of their Confederate First National, and on the other side, to show how American they were, they had a picture of George Washington. Unfortunately, that flag doesn't exist today. So these ethnic groups would use these symbols as a point of unit pride to make their flag stand out a little bit different from the other flags used by other regiments.
In June of 1862, new commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee, whipped, demoralized, and pushed away from Richmond, the Union host under George McClellan. After that, Lee moves northward. He wins at Cedar Mountain, wins at Second Manassas, and then decides to invade the north, pushes into Maryland, crosses the Potomac River, hoping maybe to get people to flock to his cause. His army will swell inside Maryland. While the Union host, now under George McClellan, will pursue after Robert E. Lee, the Union gets a lucky stroke. While in Frederick, Maryland, about 20 miles away from here, the Union finds an order, a lost order Order 191, which detailed that Robert E. Lee's army was split up into several pieces. So little respect did he have for the audacity of his opponent, George McClellan. Armed with information about Robert E. Lee's plan, George McClellan moves with uncharacteristic speed, pushing westward against the passes at South Mountain and Crampton's Gap. Fox's Gap, Turner's Gap will all fall to the Union late on September 14th, 1862. Robert E. Lee doesn't know what's happening, but he knows he needs to concentrate his army, and he's bringing the various elements together, and eventually they're going to concentrate outside of Sharpsburg, Maryland, where we stand along the banks of Antietam Creek. In coming to the Battle of Antietam, or the Battle of Sharpsburg, depending on which side you're on, the Union Army has about 80,000 soldiers, and the Confederates only have about 40,000 soldiers. Lee is at a numerical disadvantage. He's got a big swollen river to his back, the Potomac River, but yet he stands his ground. The Battle of Antietam, all fought on one calendar day, will devolve into 4 phases. They're going to fight behind me in the cornfield, in the environs around there. Later in the morning, they're going to fight around the West Woods off to my right. Later that morning and into the early afternoon, they're going to fight for a sunken road, now known as the Bloody Lane, and overlapping with that and into the afternoon, they're going to fight at and around the Burnside Bridge. Let me go into each of those phases. The fighting starts early in the morning, where the Union men, Hooker's men, the 1st Corps, followed by the Union 12th Corps, 20,000 soldiers are going to push through and around the cornfield, while Stonewall Jackson's men are going to push back with artillery, with infantry, and Jackson is taxed to every last bit of strength he has. They are pulling Confederates from the right over to the left to bolster Jackson. Ultimately, Jackson's line will hold, just barely hold, right as the next phase starts, where the Union 2nd Corps arrives, and that Union 2nd Corps will split so that some of the men fight in the West Woods, some of the men fight over toward the Bloody Lane. The Unionists that went to the West Woods met disaster behind the Dunker Church at the hands of a powerful Confederate counterattack. The Unionists who attacked the Bloody Lane found that the Confederates were not particularly strong there in that otherwise strong position. Ultimately, the Union was able to flank the Bloody Lane, get around it, and the Confederates fell back from there. And in bloody fighting, the Union captured that position. In the meantime, the Union is struggling, the 9th Corps under Ambrose Burnside, struggling to capture or get around Burnside Bridge, which ultimately they do after several unsuccessful attempts at 10 in the morning, at noon, and finally at 1 in the afternoon, the Union crosses Burnside Bridge, pushes the Confederates away, and disaster is imminent for the South. After capturing the Burnside Bridge, the Union pushed on. They are about to cut off the only route of retreat for Robert E. Lee's army. It is all but certain disaster for the Confederates. They're starting to fall back en masse. Just as the Union began to advance, however, with raw recruits on their far left flank, on that flank arrives A.P. Hill's Light Division, just arriving from Harper's Ferry, just when and just where they were needed. They hit the Union flank with a fury. The Union flank will crumble. That will force the rest of the 9th Corps back, and ultimately the Union movement just stalls. The Battle of Antietam ends there. It is the bloodiest single day in all of American history. 23,000 soldiers killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The next day, both sides were so worn out that there was no fighting on the 18th. But the Union does pursue. They pursue the Confederates as they're trying to get back into Virginia. Now West Virginia, there's a fight at the Battle of Shepherdstown, but the Southern invasion is done. They have been repelled, and this is enough for Abraham Lincoln to take the bold stroke of issuing his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which will suddenly change the war. Starting on January 1st, 1863, the war will no longer be just about saving and preserving a Union, but rather about freeing the slaves. The Battle of Antietam also, with that move, kept European powers out. It is therefore one of the most important days in American history. Abraham Lincoln ordered in January of 1862 Union forces to move on all fronts, and they did, but at different speeds. In the East, George McClellan got moving rather slowly and wouldn't actually start moving till March. In the West, George Thomas right away won a huge victory at Mill Springs in Kentucky, followed up by movements by U.S. Grant, who's going to capture Confederate forts Henry and Donelson. That will uncover Nashville, Tennessee, and the first Confederate capital falls to the Union right before spring even dawns of 1862. Additional Union gains in Arkansas at the Battle of Pea Ridge, as well as Grant going down the Mississippi and winning another battle, the Battle of Shiloh, the bloodiest up to that point, really is going to not only swing things for the Union at that point, but along with other gains in the West, such as at the battles of Picacho Peak and at Glorietta Pass, which secures the Pacific Ocean for the Union's feeling good. They have gained hundreds of thousands of miles of territory to add to their cause, and the Confederates are really reeling at this point. As the Battle of Shiloh is raging, George McClellan is assembling on the Virginia Peninsula with the largest force in the country on any side. He's got the Army of the Potomac. He's going to try to capture Richmond from the east. He's going to very slowly and doggedly move along the Virginia Peninsula, laying siege to Yorktown. Eventually, when the Confederates fall back from there, he will move up and fight a battle at Williamsburg. This will result later in the Battle of Fair Oaks and Seven Pines, which in itself, wounding the Confederate officer Joseph E. Johnston, will result in the ascension, the promotion of Robert E. Lee, who will take command of the Army of Northern Virginia, and everything changes from that point forward. In the meantime, Stonewall Jackson is occupying 3 separate Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley. Jackson moves up, he moves down, his foot cavalry is all over the place, defeating one Union force after another, and most importantly, occupying Union forces so that they cannot go and join George McClellan in helping him on the Virginia Peninsula. In fact, it is Stonewall Jackson that goes to join Robert E. Lee while the Union forces are still up near Washington, D.C. Joined by Jackson, Robert E. Lee launches a series of assaults that not only pushes the Union back towards James River, but essentially, in the minds of Americans, undoes everything that the Union commanders had done in the West. Abraham Lincoln couldn't believe it. They'd already captured hundreds of thousands of miles of square territory, and with just a few Confederate movements in the East, everybody thought the South was winning. The South was indeed winning and pushing the Union back, such as at Beaver Dam Creek, at Gaines's Mill, at Savage Station, at Glendale, and on to Malvern Hill. So whipped and intimidated was the Union commander that he fled to his gunboats while Robert E. Lee struck out northward, fighting and winning at Cedar Mountain, and then a huge battle and a huge victory at Second Manassas before Robert E. Lee decides to invade the North. When he invades the North, Robert E. Lee quickly captures Harper's Ferry, but some of his plans fall into Union hands. George McClellan now knows that Robert E. Lee is split and separated and pushes doggedly and quickly against Robert E. Lee. They will fight at South Mountain. The Confederates will fall back toward Sharpsburg, Maryland, and at the Battle of Antietam there, in the bloodiest single day of fighting, not only in 1862, but in American history, the Union will push the Confederates back. It will kind of end as a draw, but the Southerners end their invasion. The Southerners are also turned back at Perryville, Kentucky, and suddenly there has been a great sea change. Abraham Lincoln seized the moment to issue his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and it really changed the war. Starting at the 1st of January 1863, suddenly the war would have different purposes for different people. It was no longer just about saving the Union, it was also about freeing the slaves, about equality. Meanwhile, in the West, U.S. Grant is not inactive. He's trying to go down the Mississippi River to actually try to capture places like Vicksburg and Port Hudson. You also have the Union moving down into Mississippi and holding Corinth successfully in October against a pretty intense Confederate attack to recapture Corinth for their own purposes. In the meantime, George McClellan is replaced by his friend, Ambrose Burnside. Burnside comes up with a pretty good plan to try to get to Fredericksburg before the Confederates can. He does get there before Lee, but he doesn't have the boats to get around and across Lee's communications in time, and ultimately Burnside will launch a series of bloody assaults against strong Confederate positions. It is a horrible disaster for the Union, but things are going a little bit better out west for the Union. You're going to have U.S. Grant defending Corinth against some pretty intense Confederate assaults. The Union also moves forward down toward Vicksburg, Mississippi. William Tecumseh Sherman is actually repulsed at the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, but the Union is getting closer to Vicksburg at that point. And in one final battle in 1862, the Battle of Stones River, fought outside Murfreesboro, Tennessee, the Confederates have it going their way at the beginning, but those Confederates are themselves reeling back and end up retreating from that particular battlefield. And it's going to be a long, bloody war ahead.
The Civil War is a conflict that has its roots in the American mind. It's really the thoughts of Americans that help bring on that war. The 19th century is nothing but a century of Americans thinking and finding new ways of thinking. It really centers around the Second Great Awakening, that religious revival movement that burns across the early part of the 19th century. As Americans find new religions, Quakers, Shakers, and folks like the Oneida community start cropping up across America. They're finding leisure time because of new technologies. And those new technologies and that new leisure time means that they start thinking about morality. The morality they're thinking of really is the definition of liberty. The definition of liberty and what an individual can do, what is sinful and what is not. There's 3 social movements that are born out of that Second Great Awakening. You've got temperance, you've got suffrage, and then, of course, you have abolition. And abolition is what's going to start fueling this war. as across the 1840s and 50s, Americans start coming together to decide whether or not slavery is just. They're asking the tough questions. They're coming together as societies, and they're agitating for change. Former slaves are agitating for change, and suddenly this question of slavery becomes a break point for Americans. Until all of a sudden, in 1850, it comes to a head. Americans are arguing over how new states should enter the Union. Should they be free or slave? And suddenly, a compromise needs to be made. And that happens. Compromise of 1850. One of the challenging parts of that compromise is that Fugitive Slave Act. Northerners take umbrage at it. They see it as forcing them to help out with the institution of slavery, even if they feel that it is unjust and immoral. They have to return a slave, even if they don't agree. Some northern states even threaten to leave the Union over that very question, but war is abated for at least a decade. And then, in 1860, the Republican Party, that new nascent party, formed over this question of slavery, fields Abraham Lincoln as their presidential candidate. And that's just too much. He's an outspoken advocate of abolition. In the 1858 debates in Illinois against Douglas, he spoke again and again how slavery was wrong. When he's elected president, the South sees what's coming. Starting with South Carolina, the dominoes start falling, and states start seceding, and fracture points start forming across the American landscape. One of those is this one right behind me, the Potomac River. It's a fracture point between the United States and this new nation, trying to form itself. Over 4 bloody years, it's going to try to eke out an existence and then finally fail. America still lives with the legacy of the American mind that burned across the 19th century and helped ignite the Civil War.
We're here at Fort Foote, which is one of the Civil War-era forts built to protect Washington, D.C. from the Confederate Navy. For centuries before the Civil War, naval warfare had been fought primarily in the same way. Large wooden ships, powered by sail and filled with as many cannon as they could carry, would pummel each other until one of them was too crippled to continue fighting or to escape. But in the decades before the Civil War, a number of changes really altered naval warfare forever. The first of these changes was the invention of the steam engine. Steam power changed warfare in a number of different ways. Ships that were powered by steam were more flexible in what they could do. They could move against the wind more easily, and they could supplement their sail power with steam for extra speed. This gave them the ability to maneuver in ways that traditional sail-powered warships couldn't. The second major change occurred in the realm of artillery. The Civil War was actually fought in the midst of a revolution in artillery that would eventually lead to more modern cannons seen in World War I and beyond. Military officers and engineers in the decades before the Civil War developed a number of different techniques for reinforcing the breech of a cannon to make it stronger. Cannons like the one behind me were able to fire larger charges of gunpowder and bigger projectiles farther. This dramatically increased the range of the guns that were used during the war, and was further supplemented by the development of rifling, which were grooves carved in the inside of cannon barrels that gave a projectile a spin and made the guns more accurate. New shells were also developed that exploded on impact with ships, so that a single shot could sink a wooden warship. Naval architects in both the North and the South tried to find solutions to this problem, and eventually they settled on plating ships with iron or steel armor. These ironclads, as they came to be called, came primarily in 2 different varieties. Casemate ironclads were basically ships that had iron plating attached to the outside, and monitor-class ironclads, which were small boats or ships that sat low to the water and featured a revolving gun turret. The first battle between ironclads was fought at Hampton Roads in March of 1862. The CSS Virginia, the Confederate ironclad, attacked blockading Union warships and easily drove them away. The next day, the Union ironclad, the USS Monitor, appeared on the scene, and the two fought to a standstill. The battle demonstrated the superiority of ironclads over wooden ships, and also their resilience to traditional naval weapons. This also changed a major axiom of naval warfare. The ship's armor, combined with the added flexibility of movement that a steam engine provided, enabled ships to more easily take on forts, whereas normally forts had been protected and had a stable platform for firing that gave them a huge advantage over ships. Now ships could steam around and continue moving so that forts were not shooting at stationary targets, and they could better withstand impacts from guns stationed at forts. This meant that Confederates had to use new weapons to supplement their harbor defenses. Torpedoes, which today we would call sea mines, were explosives that would be submerged below water and would detonate on the vulnerable hull of a Union warship. Torpedoes were also used as offensive weapons when they were attached to torpedo boats, which were vessels designed to carry the torpedoes on a spar and ram into a Union warship. For the most part, torpedo boats were not very successful, although there were a few instances of them damaging Union warships. Torpedo boats were designed low to the water so that they presented a low profile. Taking the idea one step further, Confederates developed submarines that submerged completely. The first successful submarine attack was carried out by the Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley in 1864 when it sank the USS Housatonic. The Confederates built other submarines as well, although none of them were particularly successful. Nevertheless, the naval technologies developed during the Civil War changed naval warfare for almost a century after the war. Only the advent of fixed-wing aircraft challenged the superiority of the submarines and battleships that had their origins in the 1860s.